Look closely at this smile. In the late 1930s, this was the face of American optimism. Mickey Rooney, Hollywood's golden boy. He was the #1 box office attraction in the world for 3 consecutive years, eclipsing legends like Clark Gable and Humphrey Bogart. He starred in over 300 films, generated billions of dollars for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and became the global symbol of eternal youth. But the boy on the screen was a fabrication. Behind the white picket fences of his movies, the reality was a sweatshop. He was not a child, he was an industrial product. He was injected with amphetamines to perform and sedatives to sleep. He was chemically managed and physically stunted by a studio system that needed him to remain a boy forever. And the tragedy did not end when the camera stopped rolling. After 93 years of relentless labor, the man who built a studio and supported generations of dependents died with an estate valued at just $18,000. From the systematic torture of the Golden Age to the horrors of financial gaslighting and elder abuse in his final years, his life serves as the ultimate indictment of the entertainment industry. How did the biggest king in Hollywood history die a destitute pauper? He was born Joe Yule Jr. on a dining room table in Brooklyn in 1920. He did not have a nursery. He had a dressing room. His parents were vaudeville performers, a tier of entertainment defined by grit, desperation, and the relentless need to please a crowd. He walked onto a stage at 17 months old. He never really walked off. Most children learn to play with blocks. Mickey learned to play an audience. He learned that love was a sound. It was the sound of applause. If the noise stopped, you were nothing. If the noise was loud, you were safe. This Pavlovian conditioning was wired into his brain before he could read. By the time he arrived in Hollywood, the silent era was dying, and the talkies were born. The industry was hungry for novelty. Mickey was not a child actor in the modern sense. He was a miniature adult. He had the timing of a veteran comic and the face of a cherub. He spent his early years in the trenches of low-budget shorts, playing a character called Mickey Maguire. He played this role for 78 episodes. He dyed his hair black. He wore the costume. He became the character so thoroughly that his mother legally changed his name to Mickey Maguire to avoid paying royalties to the comic strip creator. This was the first theft of his identity. He was not a boy. He was a copyright infringement workaround. When the legal threats became too much, the name was changed again. Mickey Rooney was born, but the dynamic remained the same. He was a vessel. In 1934, he signed with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. This was the turning point. This was the moment the wolf invited the lamb to dinner. Louis B. Mayer, the tyrannical head of MGM, did not see a talented teenager. He saw a solution to a national problem. The United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. People were starving. The world was darkening with the shadow of impending war in Europe. Americans did not want realism. They wanted comfort. They wanted a reflection of a life they wished they had. Mayer created the perfect drug, the Andy Hardy series. Andy Hardy was the idealized American son. He lived in the idealized American town of Carvel. He had a stern but loving judge for a father. His problems were trivial. He needed a date for the dance. He needed $20 to buy a jalopy. He needed to learn a lesson about honesty. Mickey Rooney inhabited Andy Hardy with a terrifying intensity. He gave the character a manic, explosive energy that captivated the world. When Mickey cried on screen, the audience wept. When he laughed, the depression lifted for 90 minutes. But behind the white picket fence of Carvel, the reality was a sweatshop. The success of the first Andy Hardy film in 1937 turned MGM into a factory dedicated to the production of Mickey Rooney. The demand was insatiable. Mayer ordered sequels immediately. There were no breaks. There were no vacations. Mickey was forced to film back-to-back projects. He would finish an Andy Hardy film on a Friday and start a musical with Judy Garland on a Monday. The workload was physically impossible for a growing boy. To maintain the frantic energy required for the character, the studio turned to chemistry. The doctors on the MGM lot were not there to heal. They were there to optimize production. They injected him with B12 and amphetamines to wake him up at dawn. They kept him vibrating with energy through 18-hour shoots. When the adrenaline became unmanageable, they dosed him with sedatives to knock him out for 4 hours of comatose sleep before restarting the machine. He was living in a chemical blur. His body was developing, but his environment was designed to arrest his development. He was 19 years old, earning a salary that would be equivalent to millions today. Yet he had to ask permission to go to the bathroom. He was the biggest star in the world, yet he was treated like an unruly toddler who needed a nap. The psychological fracture was inevitable. On screen, he was the asexual, innocent virgin, fumbling with girls and asking his father for advice. Off-screen, he was a raging torrent of testosterone. He was sleeping with Hollywood starlets. He was gambling. He was frequenting brothels. He was living the life of a hedonistic adult while trapped in the short pants of a child. This duality created a toxic pressure cooker. The public saw Andy Hardy. Mickey felt like a fraud. He knew that the love he received was conditional. They loved the mask, not the man. MGM knew this too. They were terrified of his biology. Every inch he grew was a threat to the bottom line. Every hair on his chest was a liability. The studio went to grotesque lengths to maintain the illusion. They bound his chest to make him look younger. They forced him to wear lifts or stand in trenches to manipulate his height relative to his co-stars, not to make him look tall, but to keep him looking cute. They managed his hairline. They managed his voice. They were fighting a war against nature, and Mickey was the battlefield. By 1940, the cracks were invisible to the audience, but they were widening in the foundation. Mickey was 20 years old. He was at the absolute zenith of his power. He had just starred in Babes in Arms and Strike Up the Band. He was nominated for an Academy Award. He was the golden boy who could do no wrong. He believed the hype. He believed he was invincible. He believed that this level of adoration was a permanent state of affairs. He did not understand that he was standing on a trapdoor. He was surrounded by sycophants. His mother, Nell, and his stepfather managed his money, or rather they managed the illusion of his money. Mickey was too busy working to check the ledgers. He was too busy memorizing lines to look at his bank statements. He trusted them. He assumed that the mountains of cash he was generating were being piled up for his future. He didn't know that the parasites were already feeding. He didn't know that the family business was actually a looting operation. The year 1941 marked the end of the Age of Innocence for America and the end of the age of supremacy for Mickey Rooney. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The world exploded. The trivial problems of Andy Hardy suddenly looked obsolete. The audience was about to grow up. They were about to face death and destruction on a global scale. They would no longer need a boy to distract them. They would need men to lead them. Mickey Rooney, the patriot, wanted to serve. He wanted to be a man. He enlisted. It was the honorable thing to do. It was the brave thing to do. But for his career, it was suicide. He was leaving Hollywood as the king. He did not know that he was abdicating his throne. He did not know that when he returned, the castle would be locked and the key would no longer fit. The train was leaving the station, carrying the soldier away from the dream factory, and the boy who waved goodbye from the platform was never coming back. The World War II years were a paradox for Mickey Rooney. In the uniform of the United States Army, He finally found the dignity that Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had denied him. He was Sergeant Joe Ewell, Jr. He was a soldier. He was a man among men. For the first time in his life, the respect he received was not based on his ability to mug for a camera or cry on cue. It was based on his service. He served in the Jeep shows, a grueling entertainment circuit designed to boost morale on the front lines. He performed under fire. He slept in mud. He saw the broken bodies of boys who had grown up watching Andy Hardy. He looked death in the face. The war aged him. It stripped away the baby fat of the eternal teenager and replaced it with the hard, weary look of a survivor. He believed this transformation was an asset. He believed he was returning to Hollywood with a new depth, a new gravity that would allow him to transition into the serious roles he craved. He imagined himself stepping into the shoes of a James Cagney or an Edward G. Robinson, men who were not classically handsome but commanded the screen with sheer force of will. He was wrong. He was catastrophically wrong. When Mickey Rooney stepped off the train in Los Angeles in 1945, the climate had changed. The atmosphere of the industry had shifted from the sunny optimism of the pre-war years to a darker, more cynical realism. The audience was different. The women who had swooned over him in 1939 were now war widows or hardened wives who had run factories while their husbands were away. They didn't want a boy to mother. They wanted a man to fantasize about. They wanted Gregory Peck. They wanted Humphrey Bogart. They wanted tall, dark, and dangerous. Mickey Rooney was none of these things. The physical reality of his return was a shock to the system. He was 25 years old, but he looked simultaneously younger and older than his age. He was still 5 feet, 2 inches tall. That had not changed. But the proportions had shifted. He had thickened. The cute, boundless energy of the teenager had curdled into a frantic, nervous intensity. And then there was the hair. The famous unruly mop that had been part of the Andy Hardy brand was thinning. The hairline was retreating. In the brutal calculus of Hollywood casting, a balding short man is not a romantic lead. He is a character actor. He is the sidekick. He is the comic relief. He is the villain. He is never the hero. Mickey walked into the MGM offices expecting a hero's welcome. He expected scripts tailored to his new maturity. He expected the machine to restart. Instead, he found silence. The studio executives looked at him with the cold, appraising eyes of butchers, examining a piece of meat that had been left out of the freezer too long. They saw the receding hairline. They saw the lack of height. They realized that the Andy Hardy suit no longer fit, and they had no interest in tailoring a new one. The meeting with the executives was not a negotiation, it was an autopsy. They told him, in no uncertain terms, that his era was over. They didn't care about his talent. They didn't care that he could sing, dance, act, and play every instrument in the orchestra. They didn't care that he had practically built the studio with his sweat equity. They cared about the look, and the look was gone. The betrayal was absolute. MGM had prevented him from growing up naturally, forcing him to bind his chest and play a child for a decade. Now, they punished him for the inevitable result of that suppression. They had squeezed the toothpaste out of the tube, and now that the tube was flat, they were throwing it in the trash. They released him from his contract. The biggest star in the world, the man who had carried the industry on his back through the Great Depression, was unemployed. He was 25 years old. He was a has-been before he had even begun his adult life. This is the specific cruelty of the child star syndrome. It is not a slow fade. It is a guillotine. One day you are the king. The next day you are a punchline. The phone stopped ringing. The scripts stopped coming. The invitations to the A-list parties evaporated. Mickey was left standing in the wreckage of his own fame, bewildered and angry. He tried to fight back. He formed his own production company. He tried to make movies on his own terms, but he discovered that without the distribution muscle of a major studio, he was shouting into a void. Then came the second blow, the financial execution. With his career in freefall, Mickey turned to his reserves. He assumed he was wealthy. He had generated millions of dollars in box office receipts. He had lived a relatively modest life during the war. He expected to find a fortress of cash that would allow him to weather the storm and reinvent himself. He went to the accounts managed by his mother, Nell, and his business manager. He found air. The vault was empty. The money was gone. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was systematic looting. His mother, the woman who had birthed him on a table and pushed him onto the stage, had viewed her son not as a person, but as a winning lottery ticket. She and his managers had funneled his earnings into their own ventures, their own lifestyles, their own pockets. They had justified it to themselves, perhaps, as family money. But the result was theft. This is financial gaslighting on a massive scale. For years, they had told him not to worry about money, that they were taking care of it, that he was set for life. They kept him ignorant to keep him compliant. If he had known he was broke, he might have asked questions. He might have demanded control. By keeping him in the dark, they maintained their power over him. Mickey Rooney stood in the office of his lawyers, staring at the ledgers that detailed the robbery of his life's work. The betrayal was so intimate, it was nauseating. It wasn't a faceless corporation that had robbed him. It was his own blood. The people who were supposed to protect him were the wolves. He was broke. He was unemployed. He was chemically dependent on pills to sleep and pills to wake up. A habit MGM had installed and the war had solidified. He had a lifestyle he could no longer afford. He had alimony payments beginning to pile up from a failed teenage marriage to Ava Gardner, another relationship sabotaged by the studio's interference. The panic set in. It was a cold, gripping terror. He had no skills other than performing. He couldn't go back to school. He couldn't get a trade. He was Mickey Rooney. He was famous, which meant he couldn't even work a normal job without creating a spectacle. He was trapped in the prison of his own persona. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He said yes. He said yes to bad scripts. He said yes to low-budget knockoffs. He said yes to nightclub appearances in second-tier cities. The degradation began slowly. A B-movie here, a radio guest spot there. He became a hustle. He was no longer building a legacy. He was paying the rent. The public watched this decline with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. There is a dark part of the human psyche that enjoys seeing a god fall. It validates the mediocrity of the average life. To see Mickey Rooney, the boy who had it all, sweating on a small stage in a smoky club trying too hard to make people laugh, was a spectacle of tragedy. He tried to reinvent himself. He starred in Killer McCoy, 1947, a gritty boxing movie trying to leverage his toughness. It was a moderate success, but it didn't change the perception. He was still Andy Hardy trying to play dress-up. The industry refused to let him out of the box. Every time he tried to show range, the critics would say, he's good, but he's just Mickey. The persona he had built was so strong it strangled every other character he tried to birth. By the late 1940s, the golden boy was gone. In his place was a frantic, desperate hustler. He was marrying and divorcing with alarming speed, searching for the emotional stability he had never known as a child. Each divorce cost him money he didn't have. Each settlement drained the shallow pool of his new earnings. He was running on a treadmill that was moving faster than his short legs could carry him. He began to realize that he was not just fighting for his career, he was fighting for his sanity. The chemicals were still in his blood. The insomnia was a constant companion. The silence of the night was terrifying because that was when the truth came to sit at the end of his bed. The truth that whispered, "You are finished. You are a freak. You are nothing without the applause." And the applause was getting quieter every day. The 1950s arrived like a hangover. The adrenaline of the war was gone. The hysteria of the Andy Hardy era was a fading echo. Mickey Rooney was 30 years old, a dangerous age for a former child prodigy. It is the age where the boy wonder title is stripped away, leaving only a man who is expected to have a plan. Mickey had no plan. He only had a reflex. The reflex was to perform. The reflex was to say yes. The reflex was to generate noise, to drown out the terrifying silence of his own irrelevance. He entered a period of his life that can only be described as a frantic, decades-long sprint towards nowhere. This was the era of the hustle. The dignity of the artist was a luxury he could no longer afford. He became a laborer. His product was himself. He realized with a grim fatalism that the industry no longer viewed him as a lead actor. He was now a novelty act. He rent a legend. If a production needed a burst of manic energy, a name for the poster, or a connection to the golden age they called Mickey, he didn't read the scripts for the art. He read them for the page count and the pay rate. He threw himself into the new medium of television. The small screen seemed like the logical dumping ground for diminished movie stars. In 1954, he launched the Mickey Rooney show, Hey Mulligan. It was a desperate attempt to recapture the Andy Hardy magic. He played a page at a television studio, a young man with big dreams, but the camera is cruel. It captures the truth that the eye misses. The audience looked at the screen and saw a 34-year-old man trying to mimic the innocence of a teenager. It was uncanny. It was uncomfortable. It was like watching a ghost try to haunt its own house. The show failed. The magic didn't transfer. The failure of his television ventures forced him further down the ladder. He began to accept roles that were not just bad, but humiliating. He became the king of the B-movies. He starred in The Atomic Kid, The Twinkle in God's Eye, films that existed to fill drive-in double features, not to win awards. He worked with a feverish intensity. He was terrified of stopping. If he stopped moving, the reality of his life would catch up to him. The reality was a mounting pile of debt and a chaotic personal life that was spiraling out of control. Mickey Rooney was searching for a home. He was searching for the unconditional love he had been promised as a child, but never received. He sought it in marriage. He married again, and again, and again. Martha Vickers, Elaine Devery, Carolyn Mitchell. The names changed, but the pattern remained the tragic same. He would fall in love with a frantic, desperate hope. He would lavish them with gifts he couldn't afford. He would try to buy the stability he craved. Then the reality of his broken psyche would intrude. The drinking, the pills, the gambling, the erratic rage of a man who felt the world owed him a debt it refused to pay. The marriages imploded. Each divorce was a financial amputation. In California, community property laws meant that every time a marriage ended, Mickey lost half of what little he had managed to scrape together. He was running on a treadmill of alimony. He wasn't working to build a fortune. He was working to pay for his past. He became a walking ATM for ex-wives and lawyers. The financial pressure was a physical weight on his chest. It turned every artistic decision into a financial transaction. He couldn't wait for the right role. He needed the check today. This desperation led to the most infamous stain on his career, Breakfast at Tiffany's, 1961. Director Blake Edwards cast Mickey as Mr. Yunyoshi, the Japanese landlord. In the modern lens, the performance is a grotesque, racist caricature, a shameful display of yellowface that renders the film almost unwatchable for new generations. But to understand why Mickey Rooney, a man of immense talent, agreed to tape his eyelids and wear buck teeth, you have to look at his bank account. He didn't see the racism. He didn't see the social implications. He saw a paycheck from a major studio. He saw a chance to be in a hit movie. He was a drowning man, and he grabbed the driftwood. The tragedy of that performance is not just the offensive content. It is the total surrender of artistic integrity for survival. He made himself a clown, a punchline, a grotesque because he had lost the power to say no. The 1960s and 70s blurred into a haze of degradation. The movie roles dried up almost completely. The phone stopped ringing for films, but Mickey Rooney had to eat. He had to pay the alimony. He had to feed the gambling addiction that gave him the dopamine hits the audience no longer provided. He found a new lower circle of hell, the dinner theater circuit. Imagine the scene. A banquet hall in a Holiday Inn in Omaha or a converted warehouse in Florida. The air smells of stale cigarette smoke and rubbery chicken. The audience is there for the early bird special. They are eating steak and potatoes. They are clinking silverware. And on a small makeshift stage illuminated by harsh spotlights stands Mickey Rooney, the man who was once the biggest star in the galaxy, the man who sat on Louis B. Mayer's lap. He is sweating. He is telling old jokes. He is singing songs from movies that premiered 40 years ago. He is doing a pantomime of his own legacy. The audience watches him while they chew. They are not watching a performance. They are watching a zoo animal. They are thinking, "Look how short he is," or "I thought he was dead." The humiliation of the dinner theater circuit is absolute. There is no distance between the actor and the apathy of the crowd. You can hear them ordering drinks while you are pouring out your soul. But Mickey Rooney went out there night after night, city after city. He traveled like a salesman. He lived out of suitcases. He slept in mediocre motels. He popped pills to keep the energy up. He drank to bring the energy down. He became a machine of nostalgia. He was selling the memory of Mickey Rooney. He was cannibalizing his own past to feed his present. He accepted everything. He did voiceovers for cartoons that nobody watched. He appeared in commercials for products he didn't use. He showed up on game shows sitting in the celebrity square, forcing a laugh, playing the part of the lovable legend. The industry treated him like a mascot. They would trot him out for the Academy Awards, give him a standing ovation for surviving, and then send him back to the dinner theater. They loved him as a relic, but they despised him as a peer. The grotesque contrast defined this era. In his mind, he was still Sir Laurence Olivier. He was still the greatest entertainer in the world. He would talk about his craft with a fierce, delusional seriousness. He would lecture young actors about discipline. But the world saw a short, angry man in a tuxedo doing a soft shoe dance for retirees. The disconnect between his self-image and his reality was a canyon of pain. And yet, he endured. There was a terrifying resilience in him, a refusal to die. He survived the bankruptcies. He filed in 1962, having blown through $12 million in 1960s money. He stood before the judge, pockets empty, a legend with zero net worth. The headlines mocked him. Andy Hardy broke. Mickey's millions gone. It was public shaming on a global scale, but the next day he was back on the phone looking for work. "I'll do anything," he told his agents. "Just get me a gig." He found a strange late-life renaissance in the late 70s, with the stage play Sugar Babies. It was a tribute to burlesque, the very world his parents had come from. It was lowbrow, it was bawdy, and it was perfect. For the first time in decades, he was a hit. He toured for years. He made money, real money, millions. This should have been the happy ending. This should have been the moment the old lion secured his legacy and his comfort. He had clawed his way back from the dinner theaters to Broadway. He had beaten the odds. He was in his 60s, wealthy again, respected again. But the tragedy of Mickey Rooney is circular. He had learned how to make money, but he had never learned how to keep it. He had learned how to marry, but not how to choose a partner. He was an addict to the chaos. And as the money from sugar babies began to pour in, the sharks began to circle again. This time, the sharks were not studio heads. They were not distant managers. They were closer, much closer. He was entering his twilight years. The body was failing. The mind was tired. He was vulnerable. And in the shadows of his new success, a final trap was being set. A trap that would strip him not just of his money, but of his basic human rights. The product had been sold, resold, and discounted. Now, it was about to be stolen for the final act of Mickey Rooney's life was not a tragedy of neglect. It was a horror story of captivity. By the late 1980s and into the 2000s, Mickey had seemingly achieved the impossible. Through the massive success of Sugar Babies on Broadway and a steady stream of character roles in films like Night at the Museum, he had rebuilt his fortune. He was working constantly. To the outside world, he was the beloved elder statesman of Hollywood, a feisty, adorable nonagenarian who was still tapping dancing, still telling jokes, and still smiling that famous Andy Hardy smile. But the smile was no longer a performance. It was a camouflage. Behind the gates of his home, the #1 boy in the world had become a prisoner of war in his own living room. The irony was biblical. In his youth, Louis B. Mayer and MGM had controlled his body, dictating what he ate, when he slept, and who he married. In his extreme old age, that control was seized by his own family. Mickey had married Jan Chamberlain, his 8th wife, in 1978. It was his longest union. But as Mickey grew frailer, the power dynamic shifted violently. The management of his life, his career, and his finances fell into the hands of his stepson, Christopher Aber. History was repeating itself with a malignant precision. Just as his mother Nell had viewed him as a financial battery to be drained in the 1930s, his new handlers viewed him as a walking ATM. They established a system of control that was absolute and terrifying. They isolated him. They cut him off from his friends. They monitored his phone calls. They told him that nobody liked him, that nobody wanted to hire him, and that without them, he would be destitute and alone. It was psychological warfare waged against a man approaching his 90th birthday. The abuse was not just emotional, it was physical and deprivation-based. The man who had dined with queens and presidents was now denied the most basic human autonomies. He was not allowed to buy food. If he wanted an ice cream cone, he was told no. If he wanted to buy a present for a friend, he was told he had no money. They controlled his medication. They controlled his identification cards. He was a man who had generated over $1 billion in box office revenue over his lifetime, yet he did not have $5 in his pocket to buy a hamburger. The financial gaslighting was total. Mickey was working. He was appearing at autograph conventions, charging for photos, acting in cameos. The money was coming in, but it was immediately siphoned off into accounts he could not access. Christopher Aber and his wife took control of Mickey's finances, treating the legend's income as their personal slush fund. They used his money to buy sports cars, to fund their lifestyle, to pay for their homes, while Mickey sat in his room, afraid and confused. He lived in a state of constant terror. He was afraid to speak out because he was afraid of being put in a home. He was afraid of being abandoned. The abusers used his own fame against him. They told him that if he complained, the press would humiliate him. They told him he was senile. They told him he was incompetent. He believed them. The confidence that had once allowed him to command a stage in front of thousands had been eroded to dust. He was a small, trembling old man who flinched when doors slammed. The cruelest echo of his past was the withholding of food. Just as MGM had starved the teenager to keep him looking like a child, his handlers now restricted the old man's diet to exert control. He would go to events hungry. He would ask strangers for food. It was a grotesque degradation. The most famous entertainer of the 20th century was reduced to a state of dependency that bordered on slavery. But the spark of Mickey Rooney was not entirely extinguished. There was still a fighter inside the man who had entertained troops under fire in World War II. In 2011, at the age of 90, Mickey Rooney decided to break the script. He did something that required more courage than any stunt he had ever performed on screen. He went to the United States Congress. On a gray morning in Washington, D.C., a diminutive figure in a suit sat before the Senate Special Committee on Aging. He looked tiny behind the wooden table. His voice was raspy, stripped of the booming projection of his Broadway days. He began to read a prepared statement. He didn't tell a joke. He didn't tap dance. He told the truth. I felt trapped, scared, used, and frustrated, he told the senators. But above all, when a man feels helpless, it's terrible. The room was silent. The senators listened as Mickey Rooney, the embodiment of Hollywood success, admitted to the world that he was a victim of elder abuse. He described the isolation. He described the financial theft. He described the fear. If elder abuse can happen to me, Mickey Rooney, he said, it can happen to anyone. It was his final great performance, but it was not acting. It was a plea for dignity. The testimony made headlines around the world. It shattered the illusion of his golden twilight. It forced the public to look at the ugly reality behind the curtain. Following the testimony, legal action was taken. A conservator was appointed to protect him. Restraining orders were issued against his stepson. Mickey was legally freed. But freedom came with a devastating price tag. The autopsy of his finances revealed a hollow shell. The millions from sugar babies were gone. The residuals were gone. The appearance fees were gone. The theft was so thorough that there was almost nothing left to recover. At 91 years old, Mickey Rooney was free, but he was destitute. He spent his final 2 years living with his stepson, Mark Rooney, a different stepson who cared for him, in a modest home. He was happy in a way. He was safe. He could eat what he wanted. He could watch old movies, but the weight of the betrayal hung over him. He continued to work until the very end, not to build an empire, but to leave something, anything, behind. He appeared in The Muppets, 2011. He filmed a scene for Night at the Museum, Secret of the Tomb, 2014. He was a professional to the last breath. He showed up. He knew his lines. He hit his mark. On April 6, 2014, the heart that had beaten with the frantic rhythm of a jazz drum for 93 years finally stopped. Mickey Rooney died in his sleep. The silence finally caught him. When the accountants finally settled the estate of Mickey Rooney, the numbers were a final sickening punchline to a life defined by exploitation. The man who had been the #1 box office star in the world for 3 years. The man who had starred in over 300 films. The man who had generated billions of dollars for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, for producers, for agents, for wives, and for managers. His estate was valued at $18,000. $18,000. That was the sum total of a century of labor. It was less than he earned in a single week in 1939. It was not enough to pay for a funeral befitting a legend. Even in death, the fighting did not stop. His body became the subject of one final legal dispute between his estranged wife and the family members who had cared for him in his final days. They fought over where to bury him. They fought over the scraps of his legacy. He was eventually laid to rest at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. It is a fitting location. He lies in the same ground as the other ghosts of the studio system, surrounded by the beautiful, broken people who built the Dream Factory with their blood and sanity. Mickey Rooney's life serves as the ultimate indictment of the entertainment industry. He was the perfect product. He was durable. He was versatile. He was compliant. He gave them his childhood. He gave them his adulthood. He gave them his old age. He allowed them to chemically alter his brain, to stunt his growth, to rob his bank accounts, and to strip mine his dignity. He committed the original sin of the child star. He survived. He refused to die young like Judy Garland or James Dean, leaving a beautiful corpse for the marketing department. He dared to grow old. He dared to become ugly. He dared to become a burden. And for that sin, Hollywood punished him by consuming every last morsel of his existence. When you watch those old black and white films, when you see Andy Hardy jumping over a fence with boundless joy, do not see a happy boy. See a prisoner. See a resource being extracted. See a warning. The boy on the screen is immortal, but the man who played him was eaten alive. The credits rolled, the lights went up, and the vault was empty.